I was born in New York City, but that was only, as they say in the old vaudeville joke, because my mother happened to be here at the time. My parents actually lived in China and came back to the United States for my birth. I had a rather complicated and solitary childhood, and it was spent most of it in southern Arizona, not in New York at all, in southern Arizona, in Tucson, and in southern California. I only came to New York when I was 26 years old to live in New York, and I've lived most of the time in the United States. I didn't come to live in New York until I was 26 years old, and since then I've lived about half of the time here in New York City in various book-filled apartments, and a lot in Europe. I've lived for many years in Paris, and I've also lived in Stockholm and Italy and England, and I like being a foreigner. I like living abroad, and one of the reasons I like living in New York is I feel like a foreigner here too. New York is not the United States of America. I think I'm rather typical of writers in that I came to writing because I love to read, and I read very early. I learned to read. I think I taught myself. I don't remember being taught. I could read before I went to school, and I was reading books already when I was 4 or 5 years old. And I love to read, and so it seemed natural to try to emulate what I loved. I loved other things too. I loved music and I loved painting, but those interests came later. And words and stories and ideas and books, I think were my first love. So I started actually writing poems and little plays and stories when I was about 7 years old. But I didn't think for a long while that I was going to be a writer. I just wrote. As a child, I thought I was going to be a doctor. But then when I was in my late teens, I thought, well, of course, Chekhov and a few other wonderful writers have been doctors, but I think that writing is a full-time job, so with regret, I gave up the idea of being a doctor and joined the army of people, of readers who dared to be writers.
Susan Sontag es una de las más lúcidas escritoras norteamericanas, novelista, cineasta, ensayista. Entre sus novelas se encuentran El benefactor, Estuche de muerte, y acaba de salir su último libro, El amante del volcán, del cual ahora vamos a hablar con Susan Sontag. Ms. Sontag, could you tell us what moved you to write a novel like The Volcano Lover, a historical novel?
Well, the past is a very big country, and I think I really wanted to stretch my wings. I had the impression when I began this book that I was going to do something different and bigger than I had ever done before. And perhaps I was afraid of the constriction of the present, that one is so nervous when one writes about the present. I wanted to write a novel. I wanted to write a big novel. The fiction has always been my greatest love, and I began as a fiction writer, though I became a little distracted with some essays. But I have, of course, never had placed a novel in the past, and this was very intimidating and very exciting, because I thought, well, I'm free. If I am in the past, I'm free. It's so much bigger than the present. For instance, I wanted to write about love. And if you write about love in a modern story, you become very self-conscious. We are so, at least in the United States of America, maybe not in Mexico, we're very defensive and embarrassed about romantic feelings. We're afraid of being thought naive or sentimental. But I think these so-called naive or sentimental feelings are very genuine and very natural, and are probably just as common now as they ever were. It's the self-consciousness which is new. But if you set a story in the past, you can have people behaving in a very outrageous and passionate way, and then we say, well, of course, that's the way they were in the past. We wouldn't dare to be so outrageous now.
What are the relations between history and fiction?
Well, history is a story, of course. I mean, the words are the same in a way, or they're related in English as in Spanish. But with fiction, with, let's say, historical fiction, I'm tempted to use terms that come from movies. You can have the close-up and you can have the wide shot. You can look at people in a very intimate way, the way fiction does, but you can also set them in their historical circumstances. I mean, in a certain sense, all fiction is historical fiction. It's only that when you write about your own time, you're not aware of it, of all the things you assume about history. When you set something in the past, of course, you have to find out things. It's a kind of detective work also. You have to know more than you tell. And you must show, I think, how the past is like the present and how the past is different from the present. It's really quite an education, I think, for the writer and for the reader.
Why did you choose that period, the end of the 18th century and the Napoleonic Wars?
Well, I think I wouldn't dare go, that's already 200 years ago, that's a long time ago. I certainly couldn't imagine going any further back. I think that is probably the beginning of modern time. It's not, of course, it's Napoleon, but the French Revolution, the American Revolution. It's the beginning of the time we call modern, and I can imagine those people. I mean, you have to take them into your mind. You have to take them into your heart to write about them. I mean, there are some historical novelists who go all the way back to ancient Rome, like Marguerite Yourcenar, for instance. Well, that's wonderful, but I can't imagine. I'm too obsessed by modern problems. So the furthest back I could go would be the 18th century. I'd turn your question around. I went as far back as I could go when the problems were new, thinking about revolution, thinking about justice, thinking about the relations of women and men. In my novel, there is a lot about the situation of women. I didn't think when I started it that it would be a feminist book. I didn't have any agenda. I didn't think, it's going to make any point. I wanted to tell a story. I fell in love with these people, with these characters, and their problems and their sorrows and their griefs. But as I was writing it, I thought more and more about the situation of women, and I thought of the ways in which I, as a woman, could describe things that perhaps a male novelist might not notice. Although there are many great novelists, male novelists, who write wonderfully about women. I don't mean to say that only women can write about women, because I certainly don't want to be told I can't write about men. Nevertheless, it's probably true that a woman writer might mention certain details that a male writer might not mention. So more and more that too became part of the book. But history, justice, there is war, there's revolution. The central character is a collector of art. And he is the British ambassador to the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the southern part of Italy at that time, before Italy was unified. And
Ferdinand
the king was Ferdinand I, exactly. And he is Sir William Hamilton. And he's also the first serious modern student of volcanoes. And I think it was that started me. Is
it a mystery the way you find a theme to write a novel?
It is a mystery, isn't it? It's like something that comes, it is actually like falling in love, but it's more mysterious than falling in love because, well, you fall in love with somebody generally whom you meet. Sometimes you fall in love with somebody in your head, but usually it's someone that you actually have met. Whereas when you fall in love with a subject, it's something that happens inside. And why this particular subject or this particular story, I don't know. I think there has to be a part of it that's unconscious, that you identify with the characters. I think every story, every work of fiction does start with characters that you can identify with. In the end, I identified with everybody in the novel. I thought at first I could only identify with one or two, but as I went on writing, I identified with everyone, even people that seem very remote from me. One of the inspirations of the Volcano Lover, and I mean a kind of emotional inspiration, was opera. I love opera. I've grown, when I was very young, I liked music which was much more austere. I liked chamber music and piano music. Even orchestral music seemed too much to me. I basically liked music for small instrumental ensembles or for a solo instrument like piano or harpsichord or violin. And then at a certain point I began to love music that was much more directly emotional without losing my taste, let's say, for chamber music. I love it just as much. I added another kind of love of music. And I began to go to the opera a lot. And a few years ago, when I was at the opera here in New York, at the Metropolitan Opera, I was seeing a performance of an opera that it's not a really great opera, and it wasn't a really great production either, although it's an opera that I know and I've seen many times. It was Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin. And I was sitting there seeing this opera, which I love, but again, as I say, it's not a great opera, and it's not anywhere one of my most favorites. I thought, why can't fiction make me feel? Why can't I write fiction that makes me feel what I feel when I go to the opera, which is a kind of exaltation, or no, a sort of the being swept by an emotion. You can write fiction which is about ideas and about history and about things that make people think, which also can give them the same kind of exalting emotion that the aria in an opera does when the character in the opera just stands and looks at the audience and says, I love, I want, I hate, I fear, I desire. Fiction is so big, and I think it was that moment, that night at the opera, that I thought, well, I want to try to write a book which has that kind of power and has that kind of emotional directness without sacrificing anything of what I know, because I like to explain things, and I like to show things, and I don't think that ideas and feelings are really separate. I don't think they're opposites the way so many people do. I think that's a romantic cliche.
No, emotions and ideas go together.
They go together, and I think there really are different forms of the same thing. I think an idea is a form of emotion, and an emotion is really an idea. Perhaps they are held at different temperatures, but ideally, the great writers, like the great Russian writers, like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and they're full of ideas, and they're full of feelings, and they would never allow themselves to be categorized or classified and told, no, you can do ideas, but you can't do feelings, or you can do feelings, but you can't do ideas. Whereas I think modern fiction writers have become much more timid. So again, going back to the past was inspiring, and for me, this was really quite liberating to write this book.
Garcia Marquez says that he chooses his titles at the end of the novel. 100 Years of Solitude was a phrase that he found in one of his last pages, and then he said, that's my title. But you said that the first thing you found for this book was the title. How did it happen?
Oh, I don't know how it happened, but I think I always have to have the title first. That's so interesting about Garcia Marquez, who's a wonderful writer, of course. Writers are so different. You know, I think we're all magicians, where some of us are not very successful magicians. Our magic only works some of the time, but it's a magical process. It's full of magical thinking. And for me, I have to have the title. I have to have the title, and the title gives me courage. And when I thought of the title, The Volcano Lover, it was like a door that opened, because I thought, oh, that's going to be big. It's going to be, I don't know, it had a feeling, it had a music, it had a color. It wasn't an idea. It was more like even an aroma. The room was full of an odor that I thought, that's the book.
Did you think about a volcano?
I was
the Vesuvio?
I thought of Vesuvius, yes. I thought of, I am fascinated by images of destruction. I'm not fascinated by destruction, but the images, the pictures or the paintings interest me. And I don't know why, and I have never really tried to explore this. When I thought about this man who was a collector of art and a student and connoisseur of a great destructive force, a volcano, I actually thought, well, I don't really have to. I mean, because he was a real person, it's based on real people, although most of it is invented. I thought, well, I don't have to use these real people. I don't have to set it in Naples. I could set it in, I don't know, Manila. I could have it, instead of a British ambassador to Naples, I could have it an American ambassador to the Philippines, and there's a volcano there, or I could set it in Mexico, except of course one wouldn't dare set a novel that had the word volcano in Mexico, I think, because of the existence of this very famous Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry, which takes place in Mexico. So perhaps I couldn't have done it in Mexico. But then I thought, well, I don't know any less or more about Naples and the 18th century than I do about anything else. I mean, because you really don't know anything until you think very hard about it and really isolate yourself completely. And you have to go inside. And I wanted to tell a story. I wanted to have a mob scene, and I'm sorry I didn't have a horse race, but I have a shipwreck, I have executions, I have childbirth, I have great romantic stories, I have volcanoes erupting.
Why did you choose Lord and Lady Hamilton and the trio with Admiral Nelson?
Well, again, I thought this story was like a trampoline that I could use to invent, to suggest all sorts of modern themes. And I don't know, it's like falling in love. I didn't know that actually the relationship between Nelson and Emma Hamilton would be as important in the novel as it turned out to be. But I wanted to write about love, I wanted to write about passion, I wanted to write about history. And I wanted an epic subject. I can't really explain why this and not something else. I think there are an infinite number of stories to tell, so why one chooses to tell this story rather than that story, I really don't know. The story possesses you, but then you put so much of yourself. I often smiled to myself as I was writing, thinking what the real characters would think if they could read this book. Would they in any way recognize themselves? I think probably they wouldn't. And yet I know that
they are.
That they are there, although of course I have invented a lot. I've invented a lot, and I've put so much of my feeling and of modern concerns. When I say it's a historical novel, I will say immodestly that I think it is like no historical novel ever written, because it is very much told in a modern voice. And it's not like a you are there historical novel. It bounces back into the present all the time and raises questions from the present. I'm writing another one, actually. But it's even harder, because this one, the novel that I've started now, I'm just at an early stage, takes place not in the late 18th century, mostly in Italy, but in the late 19th century, mostly in the United States. And I find that it is actually harder, even though it's closer to now, 100 years closer. Let's split the difference, so to speak. The other one was 200 years ago, this is 100 years ago. 100 years ago is just as remote. In some ways, it's even more remote. To write about California in the 1870s is no easier. In fact, I think it's harder than to write about Naples in the 1770s. It's whatever you do, it's a great act of imagination and of fantasy. I mean, that's the thing. But you want to tell a story, you want to engage the reader. You want to do something deepening. There are many, many stories, you see. There's so many stories one could tell. I mean, you can see stories on television, you can see stories in movies. Why would you want to read? I think since reading is not something that people do as easily as they used to, because there are distractions, to say the least, other forms of entertainment like television. I think then a book should be really wonderful. It should be something that you feel is necessary, something that nourishes you, something that changes the way you feel, that deepens the way you feel or the way you think. I mean, most books that are admired in their own time, not to mention all the junk, the things that people know are not very important. Most books that are admired in their own time are going to be forgotten. So what are those few books that will last, that people will want to read 50 years or 100 years from now? They have to have some quality of necessity. They have to be ambitious.